They wanted to basically, when they got to the harder things as far as cutting and using rope and everything, they wanted to do the minimal amount possible. So, what I'm going to talk to you about is the erosion sinks and the purpose of starting those sinks in order to build the whole rest of the project. So, pits were erosion sinks. So, they say, oh, these big old holes, there must have been somebody in this little 3 foot space pounding Dolerite rocks, and it probably would have taken somebody their whole lifetime in order to accomplish that, or they would have had to rotate people out constantly because you look at a football game and you see somebody carrying a football around. Well, a football doesn't really weigh that much. You think about a Dolerite pounder, you're talking about something that could have been anywhere between 15 and 30 pounds that these, ancient Egyptians were supposed to be pounding the stone with. And in saying that, do you know what type of toll pounding something solid against something else that's solid would take on your body? The explanation doesn't match the outcome. And that's why, we're going to talk about, all the processes that they used here, because if the explanation doesn't match the outcome, then there has to be another explanation. And that's why I went back and did all of this. But all these deep pits that appear next to the monolithic sites, they are always described as working trenches. They form where the slurry basically stagnates, but it's because they had already developed the pit in that area, and then they just stepped up from there. So as the slurry steps down all of those different areas on the monolithic site, plus there's already a gradual slope going down, which helps then carry all of the hydrogel, keep forcing it downward as frequency or oscillation is input to the Dolerite pounders. Also, with the downward flow on the quarrying, that downward flow would actually help continue to move those Dolerite balls around. Because once they actually had the shape of the structure cut out, now they only have to continue pouring from the top. And that will eventually work its way down as they keep that frequency going into the stone or the hydrogel itself. That part of the process could be disputed on how they actually applied the frequency to it. They could have, done this mainly with jars, but I have a feeling that they were actually using a better process than that, which I'm still researching, so I don't really want to speak on it yet. But, when they got down to the separation, it was very brief and controlled. After the erosion was done, after the work basically got down to where they wanted to separate the stone from the bedrock, the underside was so thin from the Dolerite, what they call pounders, moving back and forth. Because if you think about it and you start up high with something and you outline the actual path you want, now the cut up top is going to be precise. And as a matter of fact, as you go down, if somebody manually goes down and makes sure that the Dolerite pounders don't start cutting into the wall, you can actually decide when you want to allow them to go out further to start cutting that underneath kerf-like wave. So the whole purpose in doing that is there's going to be a lot less material at separation. You don't have any material to remove as far as waste because you're no longer trying to remove the stone itself. You have a very thin spine left that allows you to use the abrasive rope cutting under the finish side. And this is, they always explain, they want to know, well, how did they cut these stone so flat from where they came from? Well, they used the abrasive rope. And like I will get into in different videos of mine, or I might have already in different ones, they were able to use the gel part of the hydrogel to keep the rope that's looped around outside pivot points so that they could basically twine the rope back together to make it a continuous loop. And then you have a continuous motion cutting if you want, depending on the stone itself. Now, on some of the limestone or sandstone, some of the softer stones like that, they may have actually used a sawing or oscillating type pull going back and forth. But for the finer and harder stones like granite and diorite, basalt, and all these different types of stone, they actually used a very fine abrasive, and they applied frequency by either bow against the rope or string. It depends, on what you classify it as. Typically, they would have probably been between 3 and 5 millimeters. But there was no impact. Here's what we have to remember. Everybody goes back and looks at manufacturing nowadays. They look at people cutting trees and they're like, all right, a blade has to go through with sharp edges extremely fast in order to get the kind of separation that we see the ancients get. But what I'm going to tell you is their method was just a tad bit simpler. They took and made an inner spine of a rope, and then they wrapped that with leather so that the abrasive particles wouldn't actually cut the inner spine of the rope, and had a cushion in between with the leather. Now they added a resin, and then they wrapped that with a cloth that had very fine quartz particles in it. And then again, they applied resin to the top of it. And then on the outside of that resin, they put a little bit bigger quartz crystals. And if you know anything about multi-tools or diamond bits or anything else, you'll realize that if you add a medium in between oil, water, it helps with cooling. But what we have failed to realize to this day is, if you're cutting like that, why would you want a liquid that flows away? Why wouldn't you use a thixotropic gel so that you, when you create motion, create that liquid, it stays in place because it's a gel. When the particles come out of either the hole, if it's a drill or if it's a core drill that they're doing, or if it comes out of the cut into stone, now you don't have all the dust and everything flying everywhere. The process is wet the whole time. And as soon as you stop, the thixotropic gel hardens so you don't lose it. And then you go back, you could stop in place. You might be done for the day. You might only be, a quarter of the way through a stone or something, and you're stopping for the day. But when you come back in the morning, as long as all the preparations were taken when you left, you can add frequency again and get that vibratory oscillation going. And in doing that, you basically do the same thing that you do when you move the stone on top of it, which is get the gel to turn back into a fluid so that the motion is easier. It's being cooled. It's carrying off anything that would still be left in the cut. And it's staying in place, and you get to control when it's in liquid form or in solid form. And the rope and the hydrogel is basically the whole system and everything that this whole system is set up around, because they used what they had. They had plant gums, they had acacia, they had papyrus. They knew how to make rope. They were rope people. Everything they did, wood spindles with rope gears. They used primary drives, rope driven. They used rope with quartz embedded in it so that they could cut through or oscillate through stone depending on the stone itself. They use these things to shape vases. They use the rope to shape vases, and when I get into my CNC lathe, the manual continuous rotation lathe, that I've designed, they use this stuff to actually shape the vases. All of these same materials they used at different scales of process in all of their different production methods. So when they use this method under detaching a stone, they basically it'd be like flossing a tooth. You put the floss on each side of your tooth and you pull like this, but don't think of it that you're going to see motion. Just think of it that it's just sitting there kind of vibrating a little bit at a time. And this is why the cleanly cut granite and diorite, vases, all of those different things, you're not going to find the striations and the cuts like you do with the core drilling or different sculptures and different stuff like that. So in this, you're not going to find a pattern at all, because as that thing oscillates, they're adding hydrogel at the ends, and that's allowing the stuff to come out the sides. Well, as they do that, the hydrogel is carrying off all the material that's coming out. But what it's also doing is it's also putting some of that material back into the hydrogel to also give the equalization of cut. So the quartz is harder than the granite. And when the granite comes off, it's not that it's harder, it's even, but that also keeps the rope itself from wearing away. So, when I go back and I look at stuff, I look at what the evidence leaves, not what we've been told or somebody reading symbols. All there is a functional language behind the iconography that was done in ancient Egyptian times. But here's what we got to look at. And I'm basically going to go ahead and sum up this whole thing for you. The stone hasn't changed. They picked stone for a reason. It lasts over centuries. We build with wood. We use cheap materials and everything else. And you think, well, it doesn't take that long to build our structures now, and the material's mass producible and everything else. They thought the same way. The only difference is the materials that they produced, even though they had to put a lot more time into extracting them, maneuvering them, and getting where they needed to be, they lasted. They're still there. So whatever amount of time they put in it, compare that to our structures nowadays. The structure you're sitting in right now, unless it's one of the pyramids or something that the ancients built, will not be here in 4,500 years. So they had it right. They knew they were going to use the most durable substance they had ever come across to build their structures with. And instead of thinking about it like we do with weight, this is heavy, all they had to figure out is, how can we make this slide easier? And I'm pretty sure we just covered all of that. So, what survives in the quarries isn't really evidence of a struggle. And if they use the methods that I'm talking about right here, which is theoretical, and my disclaimers in my channel information, but basically everything is theoretical hypothesis. But if they use this method, then it would explain why we don't have any evidence for slavery. It would explain, a lot of the time frames and everything, because once you get these things going and extracted, and you can watch my double helix construction method on one of my other videos that goes over how they actually did it when it got to the pyramid. But basically, once you got a chain started from the quarry to the pyramid, it never stopped. So that's how you can move that many stones at once. They weren't all going up the same path at once, because we think about the ramps that they said that they had. And these huge ramps that, I guess, when they were done, they weren't tired enough after building the pyramid, so they went back and deconstructed the ramp, because why would they want to get back on top of the pyramid again? But anyways, that's the storyline, that there were these huge ramps. Well, I have a simpler method in my double helix construction method that you can watch in the other video, but basically, they were going around the pyramid. And as they did this, you think about it, people look at a pyramid and they try and set squares up and stuff. Well, that doesn't even reach the magnitude of what the pyramid is. So they could have had 20, 30 stones going down one simple side of the terrace at a time. But I'm going to say that they probably had a set number. There's no way for me to figure that out. I wasn't alive. But, we could basically look at the space that's on the pyramid. You could go back and look at the step up method that I have to see how many steps they would have needed and what would have been the best way to space them apart and everything. So once the quarrying's understood this way, everything that follows, cutting, shaping, transport, placement, all uses the same system. Vase production, bowl production, disc production, all use the same method. So, you look at the underground pits, and I'll go through that at some point too, as for what the purpose was of even building the pyramids and what the underground chambers or internal chambers are, because not all the chambers in a pyramid are underground. So that's all I'm going to do on this podcast. And I hope that was some useful information for you. And the reason I'm doing it this way is because I've tried to reach out to different podcasts. I've tried to reach out to people in the industry. I have tried to reach out to academic people through email, phone calls, and everything else. But because I don't have the proper accredited credentials, nobody will even look at it.